The first thing Clara Bennett noticed was not her husband's coughing. It was the fire refusing to burn. A wet pine log lay across the iron grate, hissing like meat dropped into a hot pan. White smoke rolled from its split end and crawled into the cabin instead of climbing the chimney. Behind Clara, the rope bed shook beneath another hard cough. Outside, a Wyoming wind drove snow against the walls. Inside, the only wood they had left was wet. Clara dropped to her knees and pushed another handful of dry grass beneath the log. The flame caught for a moment. Then water bubbled from the wood and killed it. She turned toward the bed. Samuel's face looked pale beneath the candlelight. His mouth opened for another breath, but very little air seemed to come. That was when Clara understood something she would remember for the rest of her life. A family could own acres of timber and still freeze beside a dead fire. And before this story is over, the neighbors who laughed at what Clara built would stand outside that same strange building, asking her to open the doors. But on that January night in 1880, Clara had no building. She had one cold cabin, one sick husband, and 30 feet of snow-covered ground between herself and the woodpile. The canvas over that pile had torn loose weeks earlier. Samuel had meant to repair it. Clara had reminded him. Then work got in the way. Snow followed. The drifts grew deeper. Soon the wood disappeared beneath them. Now Clara pulled on her coat and opened the cabin door. Wind struck her so hard that she grabbed the frame. Snow reached above her knees. She bent forward and pushed toward the buried pile with a shovel in both hands. 30 feet had never looked so far. She dug until her fingers burned inside her mittens. When she finally uncovered the first logs, ice coated their bark. She carried them back one at a time, dropping each beside the hearth. Water formed beneath them as they thawed. By afternoon, smoke hung beneath the ceiling. Samuel coughed into a cloth. Clara opened the door to clear the room, but every time she did, bitter air rushed inside and stole what little heat remained. Close the door, and the smoke stayed. Open it, and the cold entered. There was no good choice left. 2 nights later, Clara sat beside Samuel, with one hand wrapped around his. His breathing grew farther apart. She leaned closer. One breath came, then another. Then nothing. Clara remained beside the bed until the candle burned almost to its holder. The wet logs hissed softly behind her. Weeks later, when the frozen earth finally softened, Samuel Bennett was buried beneath the pines above their cabin. Clara returned home alone. She removed her black shawl and hung it beside the door. Then she stood before the hearth. Dark soot stained the stones. Her fingers moved across it. She stared at the mark left on her skin. Then she walked to the table, pulled out a sheet of butcher paper, and began drawing. First came a large rectangle, 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, a barn. Then Clara drew another rectangle inside it. Smaller, a house. She left a wide covered space between the two structures. Along those protected walls, she drew row after row of split firewood. No tarp, no exposed pile. No 30-foot walk through a blizzard. The wood would surround the house while remaining separated from the living room. A person could step from the cabin door, cross only a few sheltered feet, take dry logs, and return without ever entering the storm. Clara studied the drawing until the candle shortened. By spring, word reached Ironwood Creek. The widow Bennett was going to build a barn around her house. Men at the general store stopped talking when she entered. Clara placed her supply list on the counter. Iron straps, nails, roofing paper, rough boards. Mercer Hale, the storekeeper, read the list twice. "What are you putting up?" "A business is only as successful as its people are happy. A business is only as successful as its people are happy. That is a large barn for one woman." Clara kept both hands against the counter. "The house goes inside it." Mercer slowly raised his eyes. A rancher near the stove turned his head. Clara explained the covered space for firewood. She explained that the outer roof would protect the inner cabin and the fuel together. Mercer rubbed his thumb along the edge of her paper. "You could build a woodshed for much less." Clara looked toward the stove. A dry log cracked inside it. Then I would still have to reach the woodshed. Nobody answered. By the time she returned home, the story had already begun traveling ahead of her. Some said the winter had unsettled her. Others said a widow with money and tools could waste both however she pleased. Clara answered none of them. One evening, she opened Samuel's old tool chest. His plane was there, his chisels, his square. At the bottom lay a folded piece of paper. Clara opened it beneath the lamp. Samuel had drawn a small woodshed against the side of their cabin. A door connected the two. Beside the sketch were a few penciled words. If we ever build the barn, the wood could stay beneath its roof. Clara's thumb stopped on the paper. For several seconds, she did not move. Then she folded Samuel's drawing and placed it inside her Bible. The next morning, she walked uphill to his grave. Wind moved through the pine branches. Clara stood before the stone marker, holding her hat against her side. "I found your drawing." Her voice barely carried beyond the grave. "I'm building it bigger." She placed the hat back on her head. Then she walked downhill. By June, 16 holes had been marked around the cabin. Clara drove her shovel into the first one. Wyoming clay fought every inch. After 2 days, the skin across her palms split. She tore strips from an old cotton shirt, wrapped both hands, and continued. People passing on the road slowed their horses. Some stared. A few smiled to themselves. Clara kept digging. 6 holes became 8. 8 became 12. Then one afternoon, neighbor Thomas Reed stopped beside her fence. He studied the enormous rectangle marked around the little cabin. "So it's true." Clara rested both hands on the shovel. "What part?" Thomas pointed toward the stakes. "You're actually putting a barn around your house." Clara looked at the small cabin, then at the empty post holes surrounding it. "Yes." Thomas removed his hat and scratched his forehead. "Folks are calling it crazy." Clara tightened the cloth around her bleeding palm. A light wind moved across the unfinished ground. "Then they can call it crazy from their houses." She drove the shovel back into the clay. Thomas remained at the fence. He had expected an argument. Instead, he watched Clara lift another load of earth from a hole deep enough to swallow half her body. What neither of them could see was the winter waiting beyond the summer hills. A winter that would tear roofs from woodsheds, bury outdoor woodpiles, and send grown men through deep snow searching for anything dry enough to burn. And when that winter arrived, people would remember exactly where the crazy widow had stacked hers. By the first week of July, the holes around Clara Bennett's cabin looked like dark wells cut into the earth. 16 of them, each 3 feet deep. Beside them lay stripped pine posts, some nearly twice Clara's height, and far too heavy for her to raise with her arms alone. That problem kept her awake for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, she built a tripod. 3 long poles met above the first hole. A pulley hung beneath them. Clara wrapped rope around the pine post and ran the loose end toward her bay mare, Molly. She checked every knot, then checked them again. "Walk." Molly stepped forward. The rope tightened. The pine timber dragged across the dirt, lifted at one end, then slowly rose toward the sky. Clara kept one hand on the guide rope. Easy. The post swung over the hole. She lowered it. The base struck the clay with a deep wooden thump. Clara tied off the rope and checked the post with a homemade plumb line. It leaned. She adjusted it. Checked again. Still wrong. She pulled earth away from one side and packed stones beneath the other. Still wrong. So she raised the entire post and set it again. A rider had stopped at the road. Then another. Neither offered a word. By evening, 3 people had watched Clara reset the same timber. The next morning, the general store had a new story. The widow building a house inside a barn had spent nearly a whole day correcting one post because it leaned less than a man could notice from the road. Some laughed. An older carpenter sitting near the stove did not. He put down his coffee. "If she cares that much about the first post," he said, "I'd wait before laughing at the roof." The room became quieter. Through July and August, the skeleton grew. 1 pine post became 4. 4 became 8. Then 16 tall timbers stood around the cabin. Clara's hands changed with the work. The torn skin hardened. Her sleeves became loose around her arms. She cut her long hair shorter so it would not catch beneath ropes or fall across her eyes. Every morning began before sunrise. Every evening ended when there was no longer enough light to see a pencil mark on wood. But the hardest work still waited above her. The roof beams weighed hundreds of pounds. One mistake beneath them could end everything. Clara spent days building a stronger lifting rig. She added ropes, a wooden windlass, extra anchors. She walked beneath the empty frame, looking upward and studying every angle before allowing the first beam to leave the ground. When the day finally came, word reached town. People arrived, not to help, to watch. Clara saw horses gathering beyond the fence while she worked. 5 riders became 9. 9 became more than a dozen. She ignored them. The first roof beam rose slowly. 3 feet, 5 feet, 7. Clara turned the windlass another notch. The rope jumped. The timber dropped. 6 inches was all it fell. The sound was enough. The tripod snapped sideways before catching itself. Dust shook from the ropes. Clara threw both arms against the windlass handle. The beam stopped above her. Nobody at the fence moved. Clara's chest rose and fell beneath her work shirt. The timber hung crooked. She stared upward. Trying to raise it from that angle could twist the entire rig apart. She had only one safe choice: lower it. Hours of work would disappear, and everyone had come to see whether the crazy widow could actually do this. Clara placed both hands on the windlass. One turn. The beam dropped an inch. Another turn. Another inch. She lowered all of it. When the timber finally touched the earth, several riders left. Clara walked to the pump. She worked the handle and drank directly from the cold stream. Then she returned to the ropes. Thomas Reed remained beside the fence. Clara traced the rope through the pulley until she found the problem. One wrap had climbed over another on the windlass. A small mistake. Small mistakes became large ones when 400 pounds hung above a person's head. She removed the entire line, then rebuilt it. Thomas finally spoke. "You're trying again? Tomorrow. You want help?" Clara looked toward the beam. "No." Thomas nodded once. He understood. This was not about proving she could lift more than a man. She needed to know whether the system itself worked when she was alone. Because January would not send 15 neighbors to her yard. The following morning, only 4 people came. Clara began before sunrise. The beam rose again. This time the rope stayed clean. The tripod held. Clara climbed the post when the timber reached the proper height and guided its end toward the notch. Wood met wood. She drove a peg through the joint, then crossed to the opposite end. 4 hours later, the beam rested above the cabin. Clara climbed down. She stood beneath it and looked up. Nobody laughed. By October, the frame had become a roof. Clara nailed rough boards across the rafters until daylight disappeared piece by piece. Then she covered the walls. The old cabin now stood inside a much larger wooden shell. When the first snowflakes of the season landed in the yard, Clara walked beneath her new roof and held out her bare hand. Nothing touched it. The snow was outside. That was enough. But she was not finished. She began building a smaller, tighter cabin beneath the barn roof, using heavy logs for the walls and leaving broad passages around it. Those passages had one purpose: firewood. Cord after cord would eventually stand there. Dry, covered, close enough to reach in seconds. The townspeople found this part even harder to understand. Why build walls around walls? Why place a roof beneath another roof? Why spend money protecting something as common as wood? One December night, Clara received an answer from someone who clearly still believed she had lost her senses. A stone struck the outer wall. Clara froze on her ladder. Another sound followed, glass cracking. She took her lantern and walked outside. Snow fell lightly across the yard. One of her new windows had a long crack through the upper pane. A fist-sized stone rested beneath it. Boot prints led toward the road. Clara stood over them. Her jaw tightened. She could have followed. She did not. The tracks belonged to someone young. That was all she truly knew. She carried the stone inside and placed it on her work table. The next morning, Clara found a canvas sack near the entrance. Inside were several pounds of new nails. No letter, no name. She looked toward the road. Nobody was there. Someone had broken her window. Someone had brought materials to repair what was being built. Perhaps two different people. Perhaps not. Clara put the nails beside her tools, then returned to work. By January, the inner cabin had a stone fireplace. Clara lit its first fire on a bitter morning. The flame caught immediately. Smoke rose cleanly through the chimney. No wet hiss. No white cloud crawling across the floor. Clara crouched beside the hearth. She held her palm near the heat. For several seconds, her eyes remained fixed on the burning oak. Then she stood and opened the cabin door. 3 steps away stood the beginning of her protected wood supply. She took another dry log, carried it inside, closed the door. 3 steps. That was all. Spring brought the axe back into her hands. Clara cut wood through April, then May, then June. She split oak for long winter nights and pine for quick morning fires. The stacks climbed higher along the protected passages. Thomas visited one afternoon and stopped walking when he saw them. There was enough fuel inside the barn to last far beyond one winter. "Clara," she kept stacking. "You planning to burn all that?" "No." "Then why keep cutting?" Clara pushed another piece of oak into place. "Because one bad summer can ruin a winter." Thomas studied the rows. "And when you run out of room?" Clara finally looked at him. "I'll make more room." By autumn, the barn smelled of pine, oak, leather, lamp oil, and clean sawdust. The little house at its center stayed dry. So did every piece of fuel around it. Then November arrived. The sky changed before dawn. Snow began falling sideways. By noon, the road disappeared. By nightfall, drifts climbed against the barn walls. The temperature dropped below 0. Clara fed one dry oak log into the fireplace. Hours passed. The outer barn took the wind. The inner cabin held the heat. The fire burned without smoke. On the second morning, Clara opened her cabin door without putting on a coat. She crossed the covered passage, picked 2 dry logs from the stack, walked back inside. Outside, Ironwood Creek was disappearing beneath snow. Woodshed roofs were beginning to buckle. Canvas covers were tearing loose. Woodpiles were vanishing beneath drifts. And before the storm had fully cleared, Clara saw a dark figure moving slowly along the buried road toward her fence. It was Thomas Reed. He was carrying an empty wood sling. Thomas Reed stopped at Clara's fence with ice frozen into his beard. His coat was white along the shoulders. Snow clung to his hat brim. One hand held an empty canvas sling. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Clara already knew why he had come. Thomas looked past her toward the barn. "My wood went bad." Clara said nothing. "The west side of the shed gave way last night. Snow got through. I've been trying to dry logs beside the stove." His eyes dropped. "My granddaughter started coughing this morning." Clara opened the gate. "Come inside." Thomas followed her through the barn entrance. The wind disappeared behind them. He stopped. Rows of split oak and pine stood beneath the roof, dry enough that the bark cracked beneath a fingernail. Thomas looked from one stack to another, then toward the small cabin sitting safely in the middle of them. For the first time, he understood the whole thing. Not a barn around a house, a wall around winter. Clara pulled several pieces of oak from the stack. "Take these." Thomas shook his head. "I can pay after market week." "I didn't ask." He looked at her. Clara added more wood to the sling. "You came here with dry pine the morning Samuel died." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That was different." "No." She pushed another log into the canvas. It wasn't. Thomas tried to speak again. Clara tied the sling shut. "Get it home." He lifted the load. At the entrance, he stopped. His back remained toward her. "Thank you." Then he stepped into the storm. By the following afternoon, another family came. Then another. One woodshed had lost part of its roof. Another family had covered their pile with canvas, but wind had opened it during the night. A rancher from west of town arrived with a wagon and money in his pocket. Clara would not take it. She counted what remained after every visit. There was enough. That was what mattered. The neighbors who had laughed at the strange building now stood beneath its roof stamping snow from their boots, while Clara filled sacks with the very wood they had once said she was foolish to protect. No one mentioned the jokes. Clara did not mention them either. She simply kept opening the door. By January, the cold became worse. For more than a week, the temperature stayed below zero. People began burning wood faster than they had planned. Smoke thickened above several homes in Ironwood Creek. Clara could tell which houses were using wet fuel before she reached them. Clean smoke disappeared quickly into the winter air. Wet wood left pale clouds hanging low over a roof. One afternoon, Hattie Hale arrived at the barn. She did not bring bread this time. She came without a basket. That alone told Clara something was wrong. "A boy is missing." Clara stopped stacking wood. "Whose?" "Josiah Parker's." Clara knew the name. A thin farmer who lived beyond the western road. His wife had died the winter before. Hattie stepped closer. "The boy is 18, Daniel. He left 3 days ago." "Why?" "No one knows." Hattie looked toward Clara's window. Then she lowered her voice. "There is something else. There is something else." Clara waited. "Someone heard Daniel talking last month about your glass windows." Clara's eyes shifted toward the repaired pane, the stone, the boot prints, the sack of nails. Hattie saw the change in her face. "You think it was him?" "I think I don't know." Clara pulled on her coat. She took a lantern from its hook. Hattie frowned. "Where are you going?" Clara walked toward the back of the barn. "To check something." The tool shed stood partly buried beside the western wall. Clara reached it and pulled open the door. The lantern light moved across a shovel. A wheelbarrow. 2 empty barrels. Then stopped. Someone was curled behind the wheelbarrow. A young man. A horse blanket covered most of him. His face looked narrow beneath the dirt. His lips were pale. His eyes remained open. Clara did not step closer. "You, Daniel Parker?" The boy moved his head once. Barely. Clara lowered the lantern. "You're coming inside." He tried to stand. His legs folded beneath him. Clara caught his shoulder before his head struck the floor. He was taller than she was, but there was almost no strength left in him. She carried part of his weight across the yard. When they entered the barn, Daniel looked at the stacks. His eyes moved slowly along the dry wood. Clara took him into the inner cabin and put him beside the fire. She warmed stew, set a bowl before him. Daniel stared at it. His hands shook against his knees. "Eat slowly." He lifted the spoon. The first mouthful took him a long time to swallow. Clara sat across from him. She did not ask about the window. Not yet. Daniel ate half the bowl before speaking. "I broke it." Clara looked at the fire. "The glass?" He nodded. "I threw the stone." Clara placed another piece of oak on the flames. Daniel kept talking. "My mother died last winter." His fingers tightened around the spoon. "Our wood got soaked. Father kept bringing it inside. Smoke stayed in the house for weeks." Clara's hand stopped over the fire. Daniel looked toward her windows. "I walked past here and saw all that glass." His mouth tightened. She wanted one real window. He rubbed both hands over his face. "So I threw the rock." Clara sat down again. "The nails?" Daniel looked at the floor. "I brought them." The room stayed quiet except for the fire. Then Clara asked, "Why did you leave home?" Daniel's breathing changed. "My father started coughing." Clara watched him carefully. "He's been burning wet wood." Daniel nodded. "I heard him last week." Sounded like my mother. His eyes fixed on the floorboards. I couldn't sit there again. Clara stood. Daniel looked up. For 3 days you've been hiding while your father is sick? His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Clara crossed to the cabinet and pulled out another blanket. Tonight you sleep here. Daniel stared at her. At first light, we load the sled. He blinked. You're helping him? Clara turned toward him. I'm helping a sick man. She pointed toward the cracked window that had already been repaired. That is glass. Then she pointed toward his hands. Those can still do useful work. Daniel looked at his palms. Clara went back to the fire. In spring, you're coming here. His head lifted. You're going to learn how this building works. Daniel stared at her. Why? Clara pushed the poker beneath the oak log. Because you already know what happens when it doesn't. Before sunrise, they loaded a sled with dry wood. The road to the Parker house was nearly gone beneath drifted snow. Clara walked ahead with the lantern. Daniel led the mare behind her. When the house finally appeared, Clara saw the chimney first. Thick white smoke rolled from it. Wrong smoke. She walked faster. Inside, Josiah Parker lay beside the hearth. His breathing came in shallow pulls. Green logs smoked beside him. Daniel froze in the doorway. For 1 second, Clara was back in another cabin. Another January. Another bed. Another man trying to breathe beside wet wood. Her fingers tightened around the lantern handle. Then she moved. Daniel, unload the sled. She opened the window, pulled the smoking logs from the hearth, rebuilt the fire with dry oak. The flame rose clean. Heat spread slowly through the room. Daniel knelt beside his father. Clara watched Josiah's chest. One breath, then another. Still shallow, but steadier. She remained there for hours. By midday, the smoke had cleared. Josiah drank broth. His hands warmed beneath the blankets. Daniel sat beside him without moving. Clara stepped outside near sunset. Snow covered the fields in flat white sheets. She looked back through the window. Daniel was feeding another dry log into the fire. He handled it carefully, as if the piece of wood weighed far more than it did. 3 weeks later, Josiah was walking again. Daniel came to Clara's barn on the first warm day of March. He carried the old canvas sack in which he had once left the nails. This time it held a hammer, a square, and a small hand saw. Clara stood in the barn entrance. Daniel placed the bag at his feet. You said spring. Clara looked at the tools, then at him. She stepped aside. Come in. Behind her, the winter wood stacks were lower now. Many families had taken from them. But the barn still held enough. And as Daniel crossed the threshold, Clara heard wagon wheels somewhere on the road. More than one wagon, coming toward her property. The wagon stopped outside Clara Bennett's fence just after sunrise. Thomas Reed climbed down first. Behind him came 3 other men from Ironwood Creek. One had laughed at Clara's plans in the general store. Another had once told his wife that the widow would ruin herself before winter. The third had taken 2 loads of her dry oak during the November storm. Now all 3 stood with their hats in their hands. Clara stayed in the barn entrance. Daniel Parker stood several feet behind her with his new hammer hanging from his belt. Thomas looked toward the timber walls. We want to build 3 of these. Clara's eyes moved across the men. Nobody smiled. Thomas continued. Before next winter. One of the ranchers stepped forward. We want to see every joint, every post, how you kept the roof from shifting, how you ran the chimney through both structures. He glanced toward the wood stacks, and how much space a family really needs for fuel. Clara folded the rag in her hands. A year earlier, some of these same men had ridden past slowly just to stare. Now they had brought notebooks. She stepped aside. Come in. For the next 5 hours, Clara walked them through the building. She showed them the post foundations, the roof joints, the double layers of protection, the places where wind entered and the places where it stopped. She showed them the pulley system she had used to raise the heavy beams. Then she pointed toward the wooden safety cleat she had added after the first ridge beam nearly fell. That wasn't in the original plan. One man leaned closer. What happened? The rope slipped. He looked upward. You were under it? Near enough. Nobody asked another question about that. Clara led them to the inner cabin. She opened the door. Warm air moved across their faces. The morning outside was still cold enough for frost to hold beneath the fence posts. Inside, one small fire burned. Thomas walked to the east passage and touched a piece of stacked oak. Dry. He knocked it against another log. A clean, hard sound answered him. Clara watched the men listening to it. That sound had become more convincing than anything she could have said. Over the following weeks, Daniel began walking between building sites. One day he worked north of town. The next he helped Thomas. Then he rode west to the Ridgeway Ranch with Clara's measurements folded inside his coat. Clara taught him how to square corners, how to check a post from 2 directions, how to reject timber that looked strong but carried rot beneath the bark. When Daniel hurried, Clara made him redo the work. When he guessed, she made him measure. One afternoon he drove a wooden peg into a joint before checking its fit. Clara pulled it back out. Daniel looked at the wasted work. That would have held. Clara handed him the mallet. Probably. He waited. She pointed toward the joint. Build for the day probably doesn't show up. Daniel reset it. By summer, 3 strange wooden shapes were rising around Ironwood Creek. People stopped calling them strange. They began calling them barn houses. At Thomas Reed's property, the outer frame went up first. At the Ridgeway Ranch, 2 brothers raised the roof in 4 days using draft horses. North of town, another family built wider passages so they could store grain beside the winter wood. Each structure was slightly different. Clara encouraged that. A house built for one family did not need to fit another exactly. Only the basic rules stayed the same. Keep the living space protected. Keep the fuel protected. Make sure a person could reach it when the weather made the outside world nearly useless. That autumn, Clara rode past all 3 buildings. She did not stop. She only slowed her mare. Smoke rose cleanly from each chimney. She continued home. On January 11th, 3 years after Samuel's death, Clara took one piece of seasoned oak from her stack. She split it carefully into narrow pieces. Then she wrapped them in cloth. Near sunset, she rode alone to the hillside. Snow covered Samuel's grave except for the upper stones of the marker. Clara knelt. She cleared a small patch of ground. Birch bark went down first, then thin shavings, then the dry oak. She struck a match. The flame caught immediately. No hissing, no wet smoke, no fighting with the fire. Clara sat beside the small flame until the light faded from the western sky. Samuel, her voice came quietly. I finished it. The fire moved across the dry grain. I wish you had seen the first winter. She rubbed her thumb along one edge of the stone marker. Thomas built one. A few seconds passed. 2 more families did too. The tiny fire cracked. Clara looked into it. I wasn't trying to prove them wrong. Her mouth tightened before she continued. I just couldn't watch another house fill with that smoke. She remained there until the oak became red coals. Then she covered them with snow. No smoke rose when she stood. Only a dark, wet patch remained beside the grave. The following winter tested the new buildings. Snow came early. Cold stayed late. Thomas burned far less wood than he had the winter before. The Ridgeway family lost no fuel to snow. Children who once slept beneath layers of quilts moved their beds farther from the hearth because the rooms stayed warm through the night. When spring arrived, the reports reached Clara one house at a time. The wood stayed dry. The fires burned clean. The outer walls took the wind. That was enough. Then, in 1884, a stranger rode into Clara's yard. His horse was tall and gray. A leather map case hung beside the saddle. The man introduced himself as Nathan Cole, a surveyor traveling north toward Montana. I heard about your house in Sheridan. Clara looked at him. From who? A mail rider. He smiled slightly. And before that, from a family near the Powder River. Clara's eyes narrowed. Nathan removed a notebook. 2 families in Montana want to build one. He pointed toward the barn. They don't know how. Clara stood silent for a moment. The idea had traveled farther than she had. She spent the day showing him the structure. Daniel copied the measurements. Clara added every change she would make if she started again. Move the entrance slightly away from the hardest winter wind. Bring the chimney closer to the center of the inner cabin. Leave more air between certain wood stacks. Make the roof overhang wider on the weather side. Nathan packed the drawings into an oilcloth tube. Before mounting his horse, he tried to hand Clara money. She closed his fingers around it. No. Mrs. Bennett, this is useful work. Then use it. He lowered his hand. Clara looked toward the map case. When those families get through a winter, send me a letter. Nathan nodded. That's all? That's all. The letter arrived months later. Clara opened it at the same table where she had drawn the first barn. 2 homes had been built. Both had come through winter. Both had kept their fuel dry. Clara read the letter again. Then she opened her Bible. Inside the front cover was Samuel's old pencil drawing. She placed the Montana letter beside it. Years passed. Barn houses appeared farther west and farther north. Some were large. Some were little more than cabins wrapped inside rough sheds. Many builders never knew Clara Bennett's name. She never asked them to. Daniel grew into a carpenter. He taught younger men the same rules Clara had drilled into him. Measure first. Build for the worst day. Keep what keeps you alive where weather cannot reach it. Clara grew older inside the house people had once crossed the road to stare at. Her hair turned gray. The pine walls darkened. The floorboards carried marks from boots, axes, chair legs, and years of split wood. The stone Samuel had never seen weathered outside on the hill. One spring morning, long after Ironwood Creek had stopped treating her barn as a curiosity, Clara stood at the entrance with a cup in her hands. A wagon moved along the road. A young family sat inside. Behind it came another wagon loaded with timber. The driver raised his hand. Clara returned the gesture. The wagons continued west. She watched until the dust settled. Then she went inside. The afternoon grew cold. Clara opened the inner cabin door and crossed the covered passage. Her hand moved over the woodpile. She chose one dry oak log. 3 steps back. The fireplace caught at once. Clara sat in Samuel's old chair and opened the Bible. His drawing remained inside. So did the first letter from Montana. Outside, wind pressed against the barn wall. Inside, the flames stayed straight. If stories like Clara's deserve to remain alive, subscribe, leave a like, and stay for the next journey into the forgotten American frontier. Clara closed the Bible. Another piece of dry oak cracked in the fire.